welcome to this evening. It is, I have absolutely no doubt, going to be a completely fascinating dive into the history of the witch and into some of the legends that were created by and for the witch trials. So I'm India, as Kathleen mentioned. I made the series Witch for the BBC, which if you haven't heard it, that's fine. I'll forgive you. But it basically involves me jumping down about 700 different rabbit holes in a kind of vain attempt to try and define what a witch is and to try and kind of get to the root of what happened at the witch trials, why they happened, why we have this kind of growing interest in it today. But luckily for you, I'm not going to talk very much this evening because we have this absolutely brilliant panel. Now, between these three people in this room this evening, I mean, we have possibly one of the deepest understandings of the witch trials in this room. I actually don't think, I don't think I'm understating that. These three people are absolutely incredible in what they know, what they've researched. They're amazingly generous with their time, they're creative, they're just stunning individuals, and you're very lucky to be here with them tonight. I'm not going to introduce them quite yet. I just want to take a moment to remember what we're talking about when we talk about the witch trials. So the most recent figures that we have for the witch trials, and remember this is something that's very difficult to put numbers on, it's hard to find data, like real data that you can pin down on something like this, but is around 100,000 trials took place in early modern Europe. Half of those led to executions, and of those it's believed about 80% were women. I think it's interesting we find ourselves now at this point in time, we're kind of 450 years-ish on from where it's kind of generally agreed that the witch trials were starting to hit their peak. Is that fair? You're doing some quick maths, Ronald. But what we see is we have this like ever-growing hunger to try and understand the witch trials. And that's with great reason. It makes so much sense to me that we have that hunger. But alongside that, we also have this real interest in trying to define and understand what a witch is today and what that might actually mean to us. Now, this topic is absolutely huge. Okay, there are infinite questions that I could ask this evening, that you could ask this evening. There are so many different angles we could take on this topic. But we are going to have to focus, and we're going to have to ask some things and not ask other things, otherwise we would just be here forever, which is fine by me. Great break from the kids. I don't think that would be that fine with this lot. They're very busy people. So instead, we are going to focus on some things. Tonight, we are going to be exploring where we can trace the witch back to, and looking at some of the definitions of the witch, and also looking at how we got to the European witch trials. We're going to look at the ways that gender has become really, well, became and still is really important in the way that people imagine the witch. And we'll also be looking at the hurdles, big hurdles that face us when we are examining and representing the witch trials, and particularly those accused. And they are hurdles that this lot are no strangers to. They're very difficult things. So let me introduce our wonderful panel to you. First, we have Professor Ronald Hutton. Ronald is Professor of History. You're going to wave all the way through, like blind date. Go on, yeah. Ronald is Professor of History at the University of Bristol. He's a leading authority on ancient, medieval, and modern paganism and witchcraft beliefs. He's the author of many, many books. It's quite astounding what he's written, including the quite stunning book, The Witch, A History of Fear from Ancient Times to the Present, which was a real Bible for us in our research. He's also written on things like the ritual year in Britain, Druids, Oliver Cromwell, pagan goddesses. I mean, what he hasn't written on isn't worth knowing. And also, I have to say, having spent 3 hours locked in a studio with him in 2023, he is also some of the best and most generous company around. We then have Dr. Laura Cuneen, and Laura is an associate professor in early modern history at the University of Sussex. Her research focuses on gender, emotions, selfhood, crime, and conflict, and the early modern witch trials. She's published extensively on the history of witchcraft and is currently writing a history of witches in their own words, which is a mixture of sort of past and present. and is co-editing the Cambridge Companion to the Witch, which I'm sure you will all be interested in. I absolutely love talking to Laura about her work. She's so keyed into what we can learn from written and oral histories, and she's really interested in the way people felt and is driven to keep uncovering that, and I think that is great work to be doing. And then we have, last but absolutely not least, Amy, or A.K. Blakemore. She's a poet. She's also a novelist, and her first novel, The Manningtree Witches, came out in 2021, and it will absolutely blow your mind. It's honestly an incredible, powerful portrayal of the witch hunts. It focuses on the town of Manningtree in Essex. It looks through the eyes of a young Rebecca West, who, along with her mother and other women around her, are accused of witchcraft. They're picked out for trial and execution by somebody who became known as a witch-hunter general, Matthew Hopkins. It shows how they became the victims of their whole town's prejudice, betrayal, and suspicion, and it pulls you into its very brutally real world, and it's difficult to escape. It made me feel angry, made me feel really sick, and totally spellbound. It won and was shortlisted for many prizes, including the Desmond Elliott Prize for Best First Novel. Her second novel, The Glutton, was published in 2023, and she's working on her next one now. Please give these amazing people a massive welcome. Oh, that's enough of me. We can begin. That's good, isn't it? We will have time for your questions at the end, so if you do think of anything, keep it locked up in your head for now, and we will come to you at the end. Oh, I need to press my button. Kathleen said, there we go. Right, Ronald. It's that big one that I'm sure you love answering, but what is witchcraft? How can you possibly define it?
Okie dokie. Witchcraft is something practiced by a witch. So the big question is, what is a witch? Now, this is the tough one, because there are at least 4 different definitions of a witch circulating in the modern world, and now bumping into each other like dodgems. 2 of them are old, 2 of them are modern. The 2 that are modern are that a witch is a feisty, independent woman who is persecuted by the patriarchy for not fitting in and rubbed out by it. The witch as a feminist icon. And she matters because the witch is one of the very few images of independent female power that traditional European culture has bequeathed to the present. Second modern definition is a witch is a practitioner of a nature-based feminist pagan religion. And that also works. It's correct. It's what happens to and with a lot of people at the present day. The 2 older definitions go back to the beginning of history and the roots of the English language. Number 1 is a witch is somebody who uses magic to harm other people, who uses magic to destroy people's lives or the lives of their families, their livestock, their livelihood. And the other is a witch is somebody who uses magic for any purpose, good or bad, although people who use this terminology often distinguish good from bad magic with expressions like white witches or good witches. It's worth bearing in mind that in my experience of the records, nobody who actually believed in magic and used it ever called a good magician a witch. It was a word reserved purely for the bad. Those who called the people whom ordinary people called cunning folk or wise folk, good magicians, witches, were those who wanted to wipe them out, were those in authority from Anglo-Saxon times onwards who didn't think that anybody should resort to magic for anything, and therefore smeared the good magicians by calling them witches. So when you put these 4 definitions together, what you get is a modern world in which the witch figure is really complex, really exciting, and really confusing.
How far back can you trace witchcraft? Obviously it's global, but how far back can you really go?
Till the beginning of history. most of us know about the horrid old test presumed for a suspected witch, that you throw the person into water, and if they float, they're guilty; if they sink, they're innocent, and you try and fish them out. Fewer people know that this test is first recorded in the law code of the Babylonian king Hammurabi almost 4,000 years ago. But you can perspective it differently by saying that most human societies in each inhabited planet, continent on the planet, have feared magic practiced by other human beings and have attacked other human beings under suspicion of practicing it. So hunting witches is what most of the human race does. That doesn't mean that all of the human race have done it, and it certainly doesn't mean that they should do it.
And it is really complicated, isn't it? You've sort of outlined those 4 definitions at the beginning and how people view the witch as well. But there is a very key difference, isn't there, between kind of global practices of witchcraft, whether now or sort of far, far back, and the witch as we might picture it from the early modern witch hunts. There's a real difference there.
In practice, there isn't. In theory, there is. In practice, peoples in other parts of the world were quite as capable of wiping out really large numbers of their neighbours under suspicion of being witches as the early modern Europeans were. In Tanzania, in 4 years in the 1990s, the Ministry of the Interior for Tanzania estimated that 5,000 people were burned to death by their neighbours on suspicion of being witches. Now, that's a body count greater than anything in early modern Europe. But early modern Europe is unusual in 2 ways. The first is it's the only place on the planet where being a witch was equated with being a practitioner of a different kind of religion, an evil religion, an anti-religion, worshipping a force of intense evil. And the other, and this is the good news, is Europe is the only part of the globe where an intense, official, and immemorial hatred of witches was transformed into an official disbelief in witchcraft and the eradication of witch hunting as an acceptable social and legal practice. And that matters a lot.
And just to explain how we got, I know it's a huge story, but how did the early modern witch hunts begin?
They begin because Western Christianity, that's Christianity, Protestant and Catholic, loses its nerve. It becomes fixated upon internal enemies, hidden, imagined groups of people in society worshipping the devil, the fears and fantasies of people, and the sense that Christianity is contracting. That this, after all, is the period in which Islam, the Ottoman Turks, are swallowing up southeastern Europe and engulfing the north shore of the of Africa, so they can then strike at the underbelly of Europe across the Mediterranean. So Western Christianity feels exceptionally under threat and starts hunting for reasons. Factor in the appearance of bubonic plague, worsening climate, destroying farming, and God really looks angry with Europe. So this is part of a response to root it out. And that's how the idea appears in the 1420s of a satanic crusade to destroy Christianity and therefore decent humanity by enlisting wicked people, getting them to worship Satan, and then giving them magical powers worked by demons so they can annihilate their neighbours.
But it wasn't like a sort of load of people in Europe sat down and made a plan for this. They didn't sort of meet somewhere, did they? It did begin. Why did they sort of start looking for witches? Who was it? And how did it kind of disseminate?
Okay, it's two forces meeting in the middle. This idea about a satanic conspiracy, which after all is the ultimate conspiracy, as anybody in your community whom you don't like could be a witch, is spread by wandering friars, preachers in the 1420s, and it slowly permeates the elites in different parts of Europe. So they are now prepared to encourage witch hunting in a way they hadn't been prepared to do for hundreds of years. And that meets another force coming up from below, which really pushes the accusations, which is that ordinary Europeans, most of them, had always believed in witchcraft. And so when the climate gets worse, when the population rises, when people are pushed towards the limit of subsistence, they turn upon each other as never before, and they now have a legal system encouraging them to accuse those they fear and dislike in their community of witchcraft. So the push to denounce comes from below, but the permission to do something about it is imposed from above.
Laura, you're an early modernist, and you've spent a lot of time looking at the witch trials. What, for you, is a witch? I know we've had some definitions. You're like, oh, India. But I'm just wondering for you, because you've spent a lot of time looking at court records, thinking about the people who were accused, looking at what happened, particularly in Germany. You know, does this idea of a witch as the accusation of a witch, does it have boundaries for you? Does it have a very clear image to you?
Well, that's a really good question. It's also basically impossible question to answer. Yeah, I think what's really interesting is that there's two things going on. There's ideas of the witch, and these do tend to be, if not fixed, there's definitely motifs about what a witch should look like, who they are. That's in art, that's in demonologies, that's in sermons. And then at the ground level, I think Ronald talked about this as well, I think what's so terrifying is that the witch could be anyone. And I've written about this in my book. I think we sort of think the witch is this clearly defined other. And in some ways they are. But when it comes to it, when it comes to sort of harm befalling you, you look around to anyone in your midst. And the fear is that any of those people could be a witch. Your neighbour could be a witch. Your mother could be a witch. And they are not easily definable. And actually, I mean, I do think it depends a bit on the territory, but in the territory that I was looking at, in the court records, magistrates actually say, we just don't know if this person is a witch. Another interesting thing about witches in terms of judicial procedure is that there is actually no real evidence about whether someone's a witch. It's often about emotions, anger, envy, spite. There's no corpus delicti. So how do you prove that someone is a witch? So I think actually it's incredibly intangible. There are not fixed boundaries. And actually in the Cambridge Companion that I'm currently editing, that is our key message, is the reason I think the witch is so pervasive through time, and as Ronald says, from the beginning of time to now and into our future, is because the witch is a very blurred heuristic category that can mean different things at different times to different people.
What drew you to get so interested in the witch trials? Was it this emotional element?
No, it actually started with failed saints. I was interested in women who had been brought to the Inquisition for feigning sanctity. That was as an undergrad. And then I thought, what other persecuted women are out there in the early modern period? And that's how
I possibly find a persecuted woman.
And that's how I got two witches. So it actually started with gender and thinking about this fine line between toleration and persecution. And I think that found its greatest manifestation in the witch trials. And the emotions just came into that organically, because I think witchcraft is a crime of emotion, particularly in the early modern period.
Amy, what drew you to the witch trials?
So I suppose it was a local connection originally. My dad lives in Manningtree, which is where this novel is set, and Manningtree was the location in which Matthew Hopkins, as you said, latterly known as the Witchfinder General, began his career, so to speak, investigating the activities of a local so-called coven. And Matthew Hopkins is probably sort of the most iconically recognizable witch hunters, I suppose, of the early modern period. And in some way, he's kind of informed our culture in quite a nefarious way, in the same way Jack the Ripper, for instance, has our image of a kind of archetypal villain. And it began more, I suppose, as an interest in how we think about our history, and particularly the darker aspects and more violent aspects of our history and our kind of national myth. Manningtree is a very kind of sleepy little town. Not much has happened there since the Peasants' Revolt. But
Very damning
Matthew
of
Hopkins
Manningtree.
happened there. Matthew Hopkins happened there. And on a sign at the edge of town, "Welcome to Manningtree," there's a woodcut of him. And that was really fascinating to me. It's a source of local pride. And until recently, there was no sort of memorial to the women of Manningtree who were persecuted by Hopkins. Hopkins went on, he puts the number himself at about 200 women and men. He was directly involved in their trial and execution. So I suppose it started with that very specific interest, and then kind of digging into the sources more, I just became so intrigued by the sort of cross-section, this sort of snapshot of a specific place at a specific time they offered, and the social dynamics that the Manningtree witch trials kind of revealed at this intense moment of English history that was the Civil War. Yeah.
I've read when you talking about the book, and when we chatted as well, and it was interesting. You quite clear when you set out, you didn't want to write torture porn, and you didn't want to like prettify things. Is that something you felt had happened quite a lot with the witch trials?
So there's a lot of witch trial novels out there of various qualities, and it's actually, as a genre, I had had problems with a lot of the witch trial novels I had read, because it felt like there was this imaginative failure to engage with the beliefs that engendered witch trials on their own terms. A lot of the novels situated their protagonists outside of the religious milieu of the early modern period, and that to me seemed like missing what was interesting in the story there. So I knew when I was writing the Manningtree Witches that what was most fascinating to me, and what I wanted to explore, is the potentially emotionally disfiguring effects that believing in an incarnated Satan, in an absolutely evil force at work in the world, in damnation, in, as we've already been speaking about, the paranoia, in particularly in small communities, how that would alter the psychology of both the persecutor and the persecuted. Yeah.
I think that's what the novel does so well, is everything that Laura and Ronald have just been talking about there, sort of looking from the ground at the way that the image of the witch is kind of built and established within that society. I wonder if you'd be happy to do a little reading for us from the book.
Sure. It's a bit harder with a handheld mic, but here I go.
Hold anything, please.
No, I think I'm okay. Thank you, though. Parliament secures a victory over the King in Berkshire against long odds, prompting a confused atmosphere of Dog Days Carnival across the villages and hamlets of Essex, the men drinking and firing their muskets off into the lilac dusk, for God's judgment is surely passed upon the unrighteous. They massage the spare accounts of the battle to increasingly extravagant divinity, and soon the Archangel Michael is manifesting over the field of engagement, and white horses gallop through their fuddled cider dreams. September becomes October, becomes November. The harvest is brought in as the languid summer finally exhausts itself, and a painted effigy of the Pope is set to blaze on the village green. Matthew Hopkins reopens the Thorn Inn with little ceremony, As the year turns, his taste for dismal costuming provokes less astonishment and even begins to make a sort of sense. While others rush about their outdoor business as quickly as they might through the autumn drizzle in an effort to repair to the comfort of their hearths, Matthew Hopkins struts about the town like a dour long-legged crow, with John Eads and John Sterne, and the most learned company he is able to find in so backward a place as Manningtree, happy as a Puritan might be. Some call him a backward man, a coal-tit. Others admire him. No family to speak of, but plenty of money, it seems. Matthew Hopkins rides his horse through a field at dawn and notices a black feather lying in the grass, glossy and ideal. Matthew Hopkins hosts. Matthew Hopkins expounds. Matthew Hopkins discourses, the town's foremost autodidacts groping for each morsel of his exultant theology. For he is, of course, a prince of air, says Hopkins, lifting the edge of his riding cloak in such a way that his learned companions might better appreciate the broidery of the hem, the sleekness of the sable. And it makes sense to them then, when he puts it like that, how the devil might thicken like butter and slide under the pantry door to cover a man all over, a man or a woman. Thank you.
So beautiful, absolutely stunning book. And what's going on there, I love, is this kind of picture of Matthew laying all these seeds. I mean, these were happening kind of mid-1640s. There was already a lot of witch trials had happened in Europe at that point. Did you kind of find from your research in Manningtree specifically, like how much was there already a precedent? How much were they already drawing on a picture of a witch? How much was being created by, not just by Matthew Hopkins, but by the kind of paranoia in the town?
That's a really interesting question. And Essex was known as Witch County because of the intensity of the witch hunting and the trials that went on in Essex. You'd had St. Osyth already before Manningtree. And you kind of get a sense, looking at Essex's history in the context of witch hunting, that familiarity with the idea of what a witch was kind of infective. The idea that there was a local coven would kind of move from one town to the other. And I think the role Hopkins and men like him played, but certainly Hopkins played, was enabling the catalyzing of suspicion into action. He was obviously a very educated man, possibly with some legal education, although we don't sort of have too many absolute biographical facts about him. But you kind of get the sense that there would be local ill feeling. He would ride in and tell people, it's okay what you feel, you're probably right. And that's kind of quite frightening. Something that I always found interesting about him was that all he claimed to do was to find the witches. What happened to them afterwards wasn't really down to him. Yeah.
That's really interesting, thank you. And Laura, how much do you find that in your research, this kind of interplay between what people on the ground, as you kind of put it, are creating and what's being sort of told down to them by pamphlets, by witch hunting manuals, by the church?
No, I think Amy is completely right insofar as everyone, well, you talked about this as well, Ronald, everyone believes in witchcraft, right? Not everyone is accusing their neighbour of witchcraft. So it is about this mobilising of these suspicions. People believed in witchcraft throughout the early modern period. And I think it really depends on the territory about how much those suspicions then become mobilised, how much territories actually do, or particular witch finders, particular councils do actually want to then make that turn into an accusation and turn into a trial process. What you quickly find as a witchcraft historian is that witch trials are highly dysfunctional. They are not a great way of sorting out conflict. So in a way, I'm always amazed in an area which I worked on of low witch trials, why they ever come to trial. In terms of where they're getting these ideas, I mean, what I found so interesting in your book, which is a brilliant book, and that's, you know, because you read a lot. Well, it's often very painful to read historical fiction about witches, and I try not to too much. But it's like, you know, Matthew Hopkins is actually reading other demonologies, and as you say, you know, when these suspicions become more crystallized, people are referring to pamphlets about earlier, you know, trials. And that would also happen, you know, people would have heard about trials, people would be talking about trials. So there are ideas about what a witch should look like, what they would do. Most people aren't reading demonologies for the fact that most people can't read those kinds of things. So it's a very messy crossover between elite and popular ideas. But there is a lot more crossover than people think.
Did you want to add something, Amy?
No, I'm good.
Okay, sure. You twitch.
Twitch of the arm.
Ronald, how much did folklore inform? Because obviously we have these kind of images being drawn up by witch hunters and in their manuals, demonologies and the Malleus Maleficarum. We have sermons from the church. How much is sort of local folklore? How much does that kind of get absorbed into what people start to imagine as the witch?
To a certain amount. Across what you might call the heartlands of the early modern witch hunt, from Britain across Germany, there's not a lot of folklore involved, disappointingly. But when you head up to the peripheries, to Scotland, to northern Italy, the Alps, and the Balkans, you find a lot. And there's no good answer yet as to why that should be. What you can't easily say is that witch hunting in the early modern period depends upon ancient images and ideas. What you can say is that rather than finding exciting bits of folklore in most of the trial records, you find that ancient ideas condition the basic foundations of the way in which a hunt operates. Let's take the enormous issue of why most of the victims are women across Europe. And the answer is, I say this with pride because I ran a research project at my university in the 2010s that was directed towards this. We assembled it inside and outside of the research grant team of 9 people so we could crack quite a lot between us. And it depends on the ancestral attitudes to magic in your area. So across most of Europe, it's believed since ancient times that women are the magical sex. Men can learn magic from books or from teachers, but women can just do it. It's in them, which is why women are the prophetesses, the sibyls, why they're at Delphi and not a bloke. They just have the access to it, which is why in this zone, when witch hunting comes, it's assumed that women are the more dangerous because they can let loose the magic with a bit of help from Satan. But there are large areas of Europe where there are different prehistoric traditions. In Iceland, 93% of the victims in a vicious local witch hunt are men. And that's because in Iceland, magic is through early writing, runes, and men do that. In Finland and the Baltic states, they have what we call shamanism, which is a tradition that practitioners who deal with magic go into a trance, and they call upon spirits to help them, and most of those practitioners are men, which is why when witch hunting gets in, it's men who are targeted. In Normandy, it's shepherds who are the magicians, and they're men, so they get attacked savagely. In the broad Austrian lands, it's vagrants, and they're mostly men, so they get attacked. In Russia, magic is assumed to be an extension of local politics, and so it's men who get attacked there. And Russia is a pretty big place. Now, geographically, we've just covered half of Europe. So the conclusion here is that the societies which hunt men instead of women in Europe have the same religions, the same gender relations, and the same societies as those that do. So none of the explanations that have been produced that account for the targeting of women in terms of early modern patriarchal structures that suppress women can actually work, because the areas that target men have exactly the same structures. So that's actually quite a big discovery.
That's absolutely incredible. And it really does, in many, many places, as you outlined, become fixed to women. I wonder, Laura, you've brought on a couple of images, because this is something that you've looked very deeply at, and how images of women and images of the witch become entwined. So do you want to start with? There we go.
I don't know how familiar this, so I work on this stuff every day. I assume that everyone just has this image in their mind, but maybe not. It's Albrecht Dürer, so he's one of the kind of really famous German artists, and this is the witch riding on a goat. And it becomes iconic, this image, and it really builds this visual imagination of what a witch looks like. And there's just a few things I wanted to point out here, which fixes so much in the visual imagination this idea of the witch as female, but not just female, but as this wild, unbridled sexuality of this older female. So I think it's quite clearly an old woman, this postmenopausal body. I think what's so interesting, it's a really androgynous body, withered and muscular and hard, and no longer feminine. But then you have this juxtaposition of this kind of wild, flowing hair. And there's so much going on here, but it's motifs that we then see play out in witch beliefs and witch trials. This is the most terrifying form of sexuality, because it's sexuality with no procreation. It's wild, it's untamed. She's obviously riding the goat backwards. If anyone's seen the 2015 film The Witch, you'll know how much goats figure in witchcraft beliefs. But that's kind of obviously a symbol of Satan. And you might be able to see there in the corner that it's actually a hailstorm that she's engendering there. So again, it goes back to Ronald's point of bad climates and the fact that witches are believed to cause destruction and destroy fertility. So very much it's this idea of the witch as obviously female, but as no longer fertile, but obviously wanting to also destroy fertility. And that's what becomes so very threatening. I think it's also just a reminder, this is 1500. Can you imagine in the 1500s the kinds of images that people would be?
Well, I was going to say, who would see this? And how accessible is an image like this? How widely shared?
Well,
and how do you react to it?
Yeah, this Dürer image was really very popular. And it would have just been absolutely shocking. It's still shocking to us today. Imagine in the 1500s, you're only really seeing biblical images, and then you see this. And obviously, she's stark naked. I forgot to say that. She's stark naked. So it's meant to be shocking, but it's also meant to be titillating as well. But what's striking is that this is very much creating this visual identification of a witch. Most people couldn't read at this time. So actually, these images have even more power, even more currency than they might do today.
How important were images, obviously images and the written word, but how important were images like this to gendering the witch?
I think what's really interesting is that these images, and there's another one, the next one if it comes, this is, I don't know if favourite is the right word to describe witchcraft images, but let's say iconic, paradigmatic image. This is of the Witch's Sabbath. And again, you can see just, Grienne was one of Dürer's students, but nonetheless, these motifs are very clear cut here of this sexuality. You've got the hag in the middle, and then you've got this kind of nubile woman riding again the goat backwards, which comes from Dürer. You probably won't be able to see it, but they're also grilling some sausages. And this is, again, you asked about folklore, symbolism. There's a real sense of this fear of witches destroying virility. some of the cases that I've looked at in my book and in my articles are to do with stolen manhood. So that does kind of translate into popular belief. I mean, I still don't know why my old friend Conrad Streich decided to declare in public that a witch had stolen his manhood. I don't think that was maybe the best way of resolving his affliction, but he did. And so we have that now on record. But, there's just this very deep fear, I think, of the female body, female sexuality, and the power it has over men. But what I wanted to say is, you asked how important they are. I think we also have to understand images in their own right. These images are well before the height of the witch craze. So the witch craze really only begins 1580s. The images I've just shown you, 1500 and 1510. So they're not just representing reality. I mean, reality, they're not just representing beliefs. They're creating a new belief, a new visual imagination. So I think we have to sort of understand that there's different sources that people are drawing from that are not a direct representation of what is happening, what people are, this is not coming from trials necessarily, this is their own language.
And older women as well, as you point out, it's particularly the first image, really massive target. I can't remember the statistics from Scotland, but overwhelmingly they were older women, weren't they? I've got that right, haven't I?
Yeah, I mean,
yeah. It's Scotland. But how did that, I mean, I'm sure that is a long, big story of why the older woman becomes such a part of that image. But yeah, I'm wondering if you can give us some insight.
There's quite a few different explanations. But I think one of them, if you think about the images, is really this fear of the postmenopausal body. It also comes from this idea, this is a humoral world system where people believe in the humours, and a healthy body is a flowing body. And women's bodies transform, through menstruation, through lactation, through pregnancy. And there is very much this fundamental fear of what happens when a woman stops menstruating, what happens to the body, to the humours. Do they become poisonous and blocked? And does that lead them to have these evil intentions? So there is something in the early modern cosmology of the body. And different historians, such as Lyndall Roper, very much place fears of older women specifically to do with their fears of the postmenopausal body. Other historians say that older women were more garrulous, more argumentative. Other arguments say they were often widows, so no longer under patriarchal control. And other historians say they were just old because they'd had a reputation for years. And actually that comes up in your book, that a lot of these people had been thought of as being witches for decades before someone finally went to trial. So there's lots of different explanations, but just to temper that, I will say that it is also a stereotype. I mean, it certainly does, there's an over-representation of older women, but I also have found trials of married women, young married women, unmarried women, children, men. So again, like all of this, it's messy. It's a messy picture.
How much do we see this imagery kind of still with us today? It's really kind of clung, hasn't it, Ronald? I don't know if you want to speak to that.
Yes, the witch is a huge figure in the modern world because she, usually in the West, can do so much work for us. She is an image of victimization of the feminine. She's also an image of fear and power wielded by the feminine. She challenges our sense of the rational. She is a figure at the heart of a collective guilt of the past. Just think of the stunning realization of the 18th century, which is only 1 or 2 generations after the actual witch trials, that tens of thousands of people had been put needlessly to death not by strangers, not by long ago ancestors, but by their parents and grandparents. That this is a very big mental sea change for European elites. And no wonder it's so uncomfortable for them trying to find whom to blame. And we're still trying to do that at the present day.
when Laura was talking about the image of the older woman and the witch, I was just really thinking of all those heartbreaking scenes with, I think it's Mother Clark, isn't it? Absolutely devastating that you've written in your book. She's the old lady who kind of is the very first person to be picked up by Matthew Hopkins and accused of being a witch. And it is absolutely terrifying, really, what they do to her and how her vulnerability plays so easily into, I suppose you could say, his desires, what he's trying to achieve.
Yeah, I think it's Mother Clark, alias Mother Beanfield, as she was sometimes called, was one of the oldest women, if not the oldest woman, obviously we're not sure of her exact age, to be accused of witchcraft in Manningtree. And we Laura kind of touched already on this idea of very often older women, widowed women, wouldn't have a male protector, which left them vulnerable in certain ways. But I suppose one of the interesting things that also connects up to the image of the witch as an older woman is that very often, certainly in Essex in the 1640s, witchcraft accusations would proceed from begging, vagrants, as kind of Ronald mentions earlier. And that's partially tied to the kind of early Protestant ethic, this idea that wealth could proceed from virtue and piety, and that poverty could be connected to impiety or evil. That if you were poor, it was because God didn't like you very much and you were going to hell. And that a sudden reversal of fortune, kind of people start looking, when bad things happen to them domestically or economically, rather than believe it's because they've done something to upset God, it's nicer to believe that it's happening because someone set a demon on you. So you kind of suddenly get this dovetailing of, I mean, you know, it was the English Civil War, a time of kind of famine and political confusion when the Manningtree witch trials were kind of going on. You get this kind of dovetailing of the idea that poverty is attendance on sin, with a time when lots of people are seeking aid, you know, kind of to help deal with their poverty. So it's kind of, it's not surprising that suddenly economically inactive older women who were widowed, who were viewed as not really contributing anything to their communities, become a kind of like, I guess, social dead weight that it's very easy to scapegoat. And I think that's part of it as well. The older women just weren't viewed as helpful or useful or constructive to the communities that they belonged within in many cases.
Perhaps one of the misconceptions of the witch trials, which you deal with really delicately in the Manningtree Witches, is that sometimes people think it might be, it was sort of hysteria and it was kind of neighbours with pitchforks, but it was kind of frighteningly judicial, wasn't it, Laura?
Yeah, I've talked about this a bit in my book, but I suggest at least that the witch is created during the trial process. There is no witch. And often there's just rumours and gossip, and people might die with that going no further than that. But it's the trial process that solidifies someone's identity as a witch. And it is incredibly judicial, and that's often the only records we will have for how this person becomes a witch. And I think what's really interesting is that there's a lot of resistance to that identity as well. That's what I've talked about in my work. People don't just put their hands up and say, yep, that's me. You know, and you talked at the very beginning about the statistic of 50% of the 100,000 trials ending in execution, but there's a story there that 50% didn't. That doesn't necessarily mean that it all ended well, because they might be fined or banished and other awful things might have happened to them. But there is also, and I think Amy does this so brilliantly in her novel, you know, there's agency there of the people who are being accused of witchcraft. And some people really say, no, that's not me. But it is a very judicial process, and I think that is basically where this identity gets constructed.
Is there a awareness from people? You sort of talked about that kind of that this version of the witch is being created. Do you think, or does it feel like it's speaking to some sort of passed down stories, passed down folklore, ancient beliefs?
I think that Laura's absolutely right, that the process of witch trials generates a body of belief and a set of stereotypes which then enable witch trials. And the role of print in this is quite important across Germany and across England. You can trace the effect of particular pamphlets describing and justifying witch trials. Now, you have to justify witch trials because right through the period there are still skeptics around at all levels of society. And the idea of a satanic conspiracy is not automatically, intuitively believable. A statistic worth bearing in mind, and Laura was coming to this, is that if you are accused of being a witch in Tudor or Stuart England, as long as the normal law courts are there, you have a 75% chance of being found not guilty. It's the unrepresentative minority who get convicted and executed, and one of the difficult questions is why. And it's this minority who are represented overwhelmingly, almost totally, in the pamphlets. And that's because the pamphlets are mostly written to justify having put people to death for witchcraft against those who have doubts about it. So not only, as Laura has said, and has been wonderfully illustrated in your novel, is a witch trial a risky business in all sorts of ways. But the very basis of it, the evidential basis, the ideological basis, keeps on worrying people until eventually the worries become so big that the convictions end, and then the trials end, and then the laws get repealed. The beginning of the end of the witch hunts lies not in an increase in rationalism or a shift in a world picture about religion. It's increasing doubts about the evidence of every case.
So I suppose that's what I'm wondering, is that during this, are people speaking up and going, this is being invented? Is there that voice there?
Yeah, I mean, the epigraph to my novel is from Reginald Scott's The Discovery of Witches in 1584. If our witches' fantasies were not corrupted, nor their wits confounded with this humour, they would not so voluntarily and readily confesseth that which calleth their life into question. So kind of already there in 1584, you have someone basically saying, everyone's Delulu, what are you on about? And Hopkins's own career kind of ended very quickly and in shame and embarrassment because people started to push back against what he was doing. And then he died at the age of 27. Yeah.
With Matthew Hopkins, you obviously had to dig quite a lot into who he was. What was it like spending time in the headspace of a man like that?
It's interesting because I ended up actually feeling a little bit sorry for him in a strange way. I think because I was trying to imagine myself from a very modern and irreligious point of view as earnestly as I could into one of the most kind of ascetic, kind of religious, rigid ways of thinking you could in terms of kind of 17th century Calvinism. And as I was saying earlier, the kind of disfiguring effect that would have on your emotions, your sexuality, the way you understood yourself, the way you understood the people around you. And it would have been incredibly more difficult to be a Puritan woman, but it still would have been, there was still that disfiguration, I think, attendant on Protestant manhood. And I began to see Hopkins as an example of that. I think one of the reasons he's so intriguing to people historically is that we will never know precisely why he did what he did. He was paid to be a witch hunter, but also there is every chance, and I think it is probably more likely, that he believed what he was doing was his duty, his spiritual duty as a Christian. And I suppose I lean towards the latter interpretation because I think that's more frightening. A person who believes that the violence that they carry out is morally justified, rather than the cynic who's doing it all for money. But I think part of the reason he is so intriguing is yes, there will always be that ambiguity there around him as a figure.
There is this sense that he kind of whips himself almost up into a frenzy. Do you think that's fair? That's kind of the feeling I got.
It's really interesting when you were talking in those images about the kind of strange admixture of disgust and titillation that the witch's body produces, because Hopkins got a book deal out of being a witch hunter and published his own kind of manual on witch hunting. And I read it when I was writing the novel, obviously, and the strange sensuality of his writing is just so striking. There's a quote in the novel. Then they all consult with Satan to save themselves, and Satan stands ready prepared with a, "What will you have me do for you, my near and dearest children, covenanted and compacted with me in my hellish league, and sealed with your blood, my delicate firebrand darlings." It's so weird. I mean, kind of really brilliant. But there is, as you were saying, I think that was a really good way of putting it, the fear of the desire that women's bodies can produce, but also I think the witch kind of embodies the absolute unknowability of another person in a way that kind of reflects unease within domestic relationships, kind of her at home and how you can't know what she's thinking. Is she laughing at me when she's doing the laundry down by the river? What are those women all talking about? And sort of, I think it's from the Malleus Maleficarum, right? When women think alone, they think evil, which is just a quote that kind of sums it up. It gets to something about kind of the solipsistic experience of being a human, the kind of, why can't I get into her head? If I can't, I'll just destroy it.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree with all of that, and I think that's why my book ended up being about selfhood. I wanted it to be about the devil. I was like, cool, but in the end, my witches never spoke about the devil. Didn't really come up.
So this is your book in Germany.
Imagining the Witch. Yeah. I mean, you would think that the devil would come up quite a lot, but actually a lot of the trials are about much more mundane things. But it is about selfhood. It's about trying to work out, who is this person? Are they a witch? Are they evil within? And how does one find that out?
I mean, I have got so many questions to ask you all. We are running out of time. Laura, I really do briefly want to touch on, because I think it is important, the reading emotions in the courts and of the people accused, and kind of what you saw there and how that was to study.
So for me, I mean, I am a historian of emotions, so I feel this very strongly, but witchcraft is a crime of emotions. It's about fear. I mean, fear is what drives persecution, but it's the belief that someone else's emotions can cause you tangible harm. So a lot of this is about ill will. It's about, what lies beneath. And so I have accusations of a woman who's accused of harming her neighbour's child by breathing on them. But obviously breathing on the child is not the issue. It's about, what does she feel when she does that? And I think, Lyndall Rope has talked about this as well in terms of envy driving the witch persecutions. But you cannot understand witches if you cannot understand the fear that witchcraft engendered. And so emotions very viscerally drive the persecutions. And also it's these mixed emotions. It's the fact that there is titillation. there's entertainment. I mean, if anyone's read Malleus Maleficarum, and I don't 100% recommend you do, but I mean, apart from it being batshit crazy, you know, it's kind of, I mean, it's not entertaining because of the, you know, the result, but, you know, these demonologies were also a form of entertainment for people, and there is clear titillation there. There's all this stuff, I mean, all these sexual fantasies that are given voice. I mean, most of the people writing these books are celibate men, or should be celibate men. And I think that's really striking. You know, so there is a sense that witchcraft gives voice to the things that you cannot say otherwise. And that's where I think the emotions come in.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Because I remember in the introduction to the Malleus Maleficarum, the edition that I have is a guy, I think Simmons, I think, wrote the introduction. I don't know if either of you know this. Is it John Simmons? But he wrote it as like in the early 1900s, and he's basically saying, you know, some people might find this as a useful corrective instruction on the rise of feminism today, and you're like, this is the 20th century, Mr. Simmons. But it's shocking, isn't it, that that kind of prevails. Ronald, how do you think the way the witch trials have been portrayed has changed, and where do you think we are at with it today?
They do all sorts of work at the present day. Mostly the witch trial is a metaphor for intolerance and persecution in general, hence the overworking of the word witch hunt in political contexts. But also the witch trial has become a way of looking at and negotiating unease between the sexes, and in particular the position of women in a society and the potential of women in a society. But just as for the witch hunters, as both of you have illustrated visually and in words, there remains something extremely exciting about the figure of the witch. The witch is titillating in all sorts of ways and all sorts of levels. I was not aware until I hit the wrong part of the internet looking through. What a flourishing pornography there is at the present day on the theme of the witch.
Was it the wrong part of the internet?
It is absolutely enormous. And I think this does plug into a very long-established theme.
Absolutely. What a way to end. Well, we won't quite end there. I just want to really check in with you, Amy, lastly, because on this, how have people responded to your book? Like, because that must give you quite an indication of how the witch trials are viewed today. What sort of significance people still put on this particular image of the witch?
It's interesting because we were sort of talking about this before, the strange questions you get, and one I get quite a lot is, yeah, but which is real? Is magic real? Which is sort of an impossible thing to answer, but also no, not in the sense that Matthew Hopkins believed in them, certainly.
So people still sort of struggling to kind of untie those questions from the witch trials?
I think so. I think there is kind of still a sense for some people that it was almost a kind of no smoke without fire situation somehow. That's genuinely seems to be a response you sometimes get. The idea that, yeah, but they must have had some power that raised hostility against them. Yeah, it's been... I mean, this book came out quite a long time ago now, and I'm still doing events about it, which is great. But I think one of the things that is very interesting about the witch trials for me, and that it has been great to kind of get to share in writing this book and talking about this book, is that it's very rare to feel like you can get the texture of a non-elite woman's life historically. And one of the reasons I became so kind of enamored with this material is that you get that from witch trial records. Sometimes you get sort of this insight into what life would have looked like for a 19-year-old girl living in an Essex village in 1643, what her preoccupations were, the way she felt about her body. And that's not something you really get. Working class women don't have history unless something horrible is happening to them, generally.
Amazing. Well, we will stop my questions there. Can I have a massive thank you, please, for these amazing people? And we do have time for some questions from our audience. Would anyone? Yeah, here we go.
Loads.
Oh, God. Lady over there.
Which is real.
Thanks, Kathleen.
Hi, I've got kind of two-fold question. First one is...
Can I ask you to do one? Because there are lots of hands and not much time.
Oh, okay.
Thank you so much.
Okay, but I guess I'm more interested in why do you think the witch in modern terms is young and green? Often. Why is the witch
Young
green?
and green.
I mean, Ronald's probably...
Yeah, I think that's a Ronald question,
I
isn't
get what you're saying. It's because of the fourth definition I gave at the beginning of witchcraft as a modern pagan religion, which is an idea that arose in the 19th century, that the people prosecuted in the early modern witch trials were practitioners of a surviving pagan religion. And that imagined witch religion actually got recreated in the 20th century in a very positive way to produce an environmentalist, feminist, and liberationist modern religion that works very well. And the idea of the young, nature-loving woman coming into her power through contact with the forces of the land and of her own innate powers is an immensely attractive and indeed empowering one.
Thank you very much. Next question. Yes. Oh, yeah, the lady there. Just wait for the mic, sorry.
Hi, just thinking of parallels with modern times, thinking frighteningly of today's incel movement and people like Andrew Tate. It'd be really good if you could address that.
Is there a specific question?
Well, just scarily, the parallels in terms of doing harm to women,
I can. I think one of the things that was most striking about me in diving into the history of the witch trials was how quickly and how easily people can be othered and made to be less than human in a way that then justifies violence being done against them. I spoke about Mother Clark earlier, one of Hopkins's victims, and the way she is described and the kind of venom that is aimed against her put me in mind of, it was a few years ago I was writing the book, but tabloid attacks on the idea of benefit scroungers. I thought the parallels there were really interesting. I think one of the things that the witch trials can teach us in the context of contemporary life is if you're being told by someone in a position of power that all your problems are being caused by someone who is disempowered, there is probably a reason you were being told that. And I think that's probably applicable to lots of the kind of things you're gesturing to there. But there's certainly, it's weirdly something that people say quite a lot, that Hopkins sort of seems like a strange proto-incel. And I don't disagree with that in some ways, because there is the same mingling of disgust and titillation in Hopkins's ideologies, certainly, as the kind of contemporary incel and manosphere movements. But it's not a parallel I would want to come down on a kind of way that flattens the danger presented by either, and I think that's kind of a risk, perhaps.
Thank you, Amy. Yes, this gentleman at the front.
Amy said that Hopkins...
Is it on?
Yeah. Hello?
There we go.
Yeah.
Amy said that Hopkins was a fierce Calvinist. How much was the rise of the witch hunt or the witch hunt movement a product of the Protestant Reformation?
Okay. No, good one. Something worth bearing in mind is that 80% of the people put to death in the European witch hunts died in one long lifetime between 1560 and 1650. And this is because it's the time when the Reformation struggle is at its height, when Protestant and Catholic have given up trying to kiss and make up and are trying to annihilate each other. So all over Europe, the religious thermometer is zooming up to fever pitch. And witch hunting is always part of a package that includes Catholic hunting or Protestant hunting, Jew hunting, and vagrant hunting. It's a clean-up on the neighborhood. And in this context, a satanic conspiracy makes better sense than it does at other times. Similarly, when the wars of religion come to an end and Protestant and Catholic realize that for some reason God wants them both to carry on existing, the thermometer comes straight down, and toleration of accused witches, Protestants, Catholics, Jews, vagrants, fornicators, and every other form of Christian no-no comes up together in a Europe that is no longer so afraid of plague, bad climate, and the Turks, and is starting to conquer the world.
Is that helpful? It's very helpful, isn't he? By the way, you can apparently, oh no, I'm not, no, don't do this. But you can apparently email Ronald and he'll tell you how to take a hex off you. So there's nothing this man cannot answer. But don't do it because he gets hundreds of emails a day asking that. Yes.
I've got one question online which says, why are witches always depicted as owning a black cat?
I know you know, but I'm just wondering if anyone else would also like to take it.
Okay, the modern stereotype of the witch settles in the 18th century. And she gets a steeple black hat and a black dress and often a cloak, because this is simply one of the most common costumes of poor women in the 17th century. And the black cat is the last residue of the early modern idea of the witch's familiar. Witches' familiars are any kind of domestic pet, absolutely any kind, ferrets, dogs, rabbits. But the cat is, because it stares at you like the hare, is one of the most magical of animals in folklore. So the rest of the pets get dumped and the black cat gets retained. And that's how you get the identikit picture put together.
Amazing. We've got time for a couple more. Yes, sir.
I actually have a cat, and I've called it Grimalkin, which I believe is the name which witches gave to a cat. But I can assure you I'm not a witch.
What's the name of the cat?
Very quick question. Nobody has mentioned that manual, the Malleus Maleficarum, the Hammer of Witches, which predates the Reformation. To what extent did the manual have an influence on witch trials?
It did have an influence, unfortunately, quite a large one in the 16th century. What it really did, and Kramer would be also, a forerunner to Andrew Tate and Matthew Hopkins, because he was so obsessed with female sexuality, was, as Ronald said earlier, around 1420s you get this definition of the witch being in league with the devil. But the Malleus makes it very clear that it's a female witch in league with the devil through a sexual pact. So we have from the 1430s treatises, demonologies talking about the fact that the witch is satanic, wants to overthrow Christendom, but it's not starkly gendered and it's not always a sexual pact. And the Malleus really changes that. So you see the Malleus's direct influence also in the images that I showed you. In the end, other demonologies come and supplant the Malleus, but it ends up just being so... the longevity of the Malleus remains because it is so starkly to do with a female witch in a way that actually 16th, 17th century demonologies are a little bit more open about the gendering of the witch. It's usually women, but they do allow for men as well. For Kramer, it's all about women to do with their carnal lusting. It goes back also to what Ronald was saying, is that women are seen as the weaker vessel, more like Eve, more open to divine influence as well, but also therefore more open to demonic influence. They don't have the strength of nature that men do. So, yes.
The Malleus is also very big. And Kramer, the author, is a great storyteller. It's absolutely chock full of urban legends, of a classic horror movie kind. So in that sense, it's a really exciting read.
We've got time for one more. Yes. Great, only one hand went up. I hate that bit. I was like, someone else pick.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. I was really interested by the, I suppose, what you brought up before when you were talking about this idea of the creation of the witch during the trial, and in particular the effect that the persecution can have on the persecuted. And I know we see it a little bit in, I want to say, the Pendle witch trials, but I just want to kind of, I'd love to know sort of how far do we see that across other witch trials as well? Is this something that you can see in the court documents? But again, this is this idea of like working class women not being really visible unless it's through these kind of judicial processes. So do we actually, how much of the victim do we actually see in this process here? I guess several questions kind of rolled into one there, I suppose. Sorry about that.
I think, no, I'm actually so glad Amy made this point about the fact that you asked me why was I drawn to witches. I was drawn to female voices, and female voices in the early modern period are few and far between. And unfortunately, as you said, you know, it's the persecuted voices that we hear. And, you know, there's no evidence for these women otherwise. There is no traces in the archives of their voices. I think it depends a bit about the nature of the trial record. Pamphlets are obviously different because they're almost literary recreations of what the trial was about. In the trial documents I work with, they are, you know, the voices are written in the third person, and I don't think any historical source gives you a direct lens on any person's voice, whether a trial or witch trial record or not. But I do think you get glimpses of them. And in the particularly long trial process, which I looked at, you get not only the people who are being accused, but you get all the witnesses coming in. You see that in your book. I mean, they're huge community affairs. And they're all trying to work out who the witch is, and they're fighting testimonies. And you see also testimonies changing. You know, people are trying to survive, and so actually testimonies change. So yes, I do think these are, so the sources I'm looking at are in Germany, but I do think these trial records can give you a glimpse. You have to be careful, but I think there's a glimpse, and I think they are worth trying to work with because they're the only source we have for these women.
Do you want to very briefly add, Amy?
Yeah. Do you want to hear one of my favourite bits of Matthew Hopkins' law, which is sort of connected? There's this great interview that Hopkins and John Stern are subjecting a woman who has just confessed or been sort of impelled to confess that she had congress with the devil. And they sort of ask her, well, in what form did he appear? What did he look like? And she says he was a man. And Stern gestures to Hopkins and says, a man like him here. And she basically says, no, he was a lot better looking. I'm paraphrasing, obviously. But I'd really, really love, I mean, who knows how accurate it was to what actually went on, but it's like you can see her, you can hear how pissed off she is about this. It just seems like such a tiny moment of defiance. And I love those kind of moments like that when, as you say, it feels like you kind of get just a fragment, a spicule of the voice 400 years later.
Amazing, thank you. That is all